Before we get into today's stories, never miss an update by signing up for the Dread Weekly newsletter on dreadsarmy.com. The link is in the description too. Get the latest encounters, trail camera footage, and news in your inbox once a week. Now, let's get to the story. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Steve Huxley. Born and bred in Duluth, Minnesota. I've been wearing the green and gray uniform of a park ranger for over 15 years now. In my career, I've come across every creature the Minnesota wilderness has to offer, from the majestic white-tailed deer to the cunning red fox, but never have I ever encountered something like what I'm about to share. Aside from my park ranger duties, I have a deep-seated interest in wildlife photography. Over the years, I've managed to capture some stunning snapshots of the wild inhabitants of our forest, many of them in their most candid moments. The purpose of this excursion, like many others before it, was to uncover more secrets of our forest dwellers under the cloak of darkness. Little did I know that I was about to cross paths with a creature that defied all my understanding of our local wildlife. The location in question was the Superior National Forest in Minnesota, a sprawling wilderness that covers over 3 million acres and home to countless wildlife species. I patrolled these woods for years, knowing the contour of the land like the back of my hand. Every tree, every river bend, every animal trail has a story etched in my memory. The purpose of this particular journey was twofold. One was the usual round of patrolling for any irregular activities in the forest, checking on wildlife activity, monitoring the health of the forest, and ensuring that visitors were following rules. A typical day in the life of a park ranger. But there was another aspect of the expedition that held personal interest for me. I was undertaking a photography project, focusing on capturing the often overlooked nocturnal creatures that inhabit our woods. Owls, raccoons, bats, you name it. This project was aimed at showcasing the forest's after-dark wonders, a side of the wilderness that few people get to witness. The mission was to set up infrared cameras across multiple trails and monitor the footage for any unique occurrences. Little did I know that I was about to capture something far beyond my wildest expectations. My journey into the forest started late in the afternoon. Armed with a map of the forest, a sturdy pair of boots, and my trusted camera gear, I set off on the well-worn paths of the Superior National Forest. The afternoon sun was just beginning to cast long shadows when I reached the selected wildlife trails, secluded areas where the creatures of the night often roamed undisturbed. As an experienced park ranger and wildlife photographer, I had developed a methodical process for setting up infrared camera traps. Each location was carefully chosen based on the patterns of animal activity and physical signs like paw prints or droppings. I began my task by scouting for the best tree to mount each camera, preferably one overlooking the trail for a wider view. Once the locations were marked, I painstakingly climbed each tree, secured the camera traps, and meticulously tested the infrared triggers. Each click of the camera, each flash of the infrared served as a silent promise of the captivating images to come. As the sun set and the nocturnal world began to stir, I finally finished my setup and started the long wait for the night's activity to begin. Unknown to me at that moment, the night would bring an encounter that would challenge my beliefs about the animals that call our forest home. I've always found comfort in the familiar sounds of the night, the chirping of the crickets, the hooting of owls, the distant howl of a wolf. It's like the forest is alive with a symphony of its own, a unique composition played out each night. But that night, something was different. As I was checking the last of my camera traps, an unusual quietness fell over the area. It was as if the entire forest had suddenly held its breath. Being a seasoned ranger, I've learned to trust these subtle cues from nature, which often indicate a change in the environment. I paused, my senses heightened. I noticed a swift, almost phantom-like movement from the corner of my eye. It was too fast to be any regular forest dweller that I was aware of. I instinctively reached for my flashlight, my heart pounding in the silence of the night. With a click, the powerful beam pierced the darkness, illuminating a patch of nearby bushes that were still rustling from recent disturbance. The forest was eerily silent except for the subtle rustle, hinting at a presence I couldn't yet identify. And that's when I knew tonight was not going to be like any other night in the Superior National Forest. From the darkness emerged a creature that defied all my understanding and experience. I'm no stranger to the unusual, having seen a fair share of oddities in my years as a park ranger, but this was something else altogether. The being was approximately 6 feet tall, yet it moved not upright like us humans, but on all fours. It was astonishingly quick, its movements resembling a sprinter but were distorted and unnatural. The pallor of its naked skin was shocking against the inky blackness of the forest, seeming almost ghost-like in the cold moonlight. Illuminated in the harsh, unwavering beam of my flashlight, the creature's face was an unsettling combination of the familiar and the grotesque. It bore large black eyes that glistened with an almost human-like intelligence. There was no nose, just a smooth surface that descended into an open, gaping mouth. But what was perhaps most chilling was the sound it made, a strange, rhythmic clicking noise. It was reminiscent of stones clashing together, echoing through the silent forest. It was a sound that seemed out of place, eerie, and completely unnatural in the serenity of the night. Even as I stood there, rooted in shock and disbelief, my mind was racing to identify this creature. It bore no resemblance to any animal known to inhabit these parts. I watched, my pulse pounding in my ears, as this unworldly being flickered in and out of the flashlight's beam, its strange eyes glinting in the stark, artificial light. As quickly as the encounter began, it ended. In a sudden burst of motion, the creature dashed deeper into the forest. Its speed was remarkable, and in a blink of an eye, it disappeared into the dense foliage, leaving behind a disturbed trail in its wake. In the silence that followed, I could only stand still, my heart pounding against my chest as the final echoes of its strange clicking noise faded into the night. I found myself clutching my flashlight tightly, its beam now casting long shadows that danced among the trees. The sudden return of normal nocturnal sounds seemed to break the spell, but the forest now felt different. The familiar trails, the rustling leaves, even the distant hoot of an owl, everything was tainted by the memory of the encounter. The creature had vanished, but its presence still lingered, leaving behind a trail of mystery and a sense of unease that lingered in the pit of my stomach. For the longest time, I stood there, my gaze fixed on the spot where the creature had disappeared, half expecting it to return. But the forest remained undisturbed, as if reassuring me that the encounter was over, and the strange creature had retreated into the depths of the wilderness. The rest of the night passed in a blur. The encounter had set my nerves on edge, and every sound in the forest seemed to carry a weighty echo of the creature's presence. I spent the remaining hours in a state of heightened alertness, my senses attuned to every rustle, every whisper of the wind. As dawn broke, I found myself feeling an uneasy relief. The return of daylight, while comforting, also brought a sense of reality to the surreal experience of the previous night. I began to pack up my equipment, each snap of the camera bag and clink of the gear only serving to bring back flashes of the creature's gaping mouth and the strange clicking noise. I left the forest earlier than planned, the image of the creature still etched in my mind. The usually comforting familiarity of the park ranger station offered little solace. Even the known faces of my colleagues and the mundane routine of reporting seemed to resonate with the peculiar encounter. In the days that followed, I found myself repeatedly questioning my experience. But each time, the memory of that pale, gaunt figure with the large black eyes and the strange clicking noise resurfaced. Each time it was as vivid as the moment I had experienced it. The incident remains an open chapter in my life as a park ranger. Even now, as I recount the encounter, I find myself looking out into the vast wilderness of the Superior National Forest with a new sense of awareness and a deepened respect for the mysteries it harbors. I don't work for the Park Service. Technically, I don't even work for the fire department, although my role as a volunteer firefighter does serve as the basis for my story. Volunteers in my position get called out to the national parks very rarely. If there's a fire somewhere like that, it's usually handled with more swiftness and expertise than a group of volunteers can muster. Sometimes we get asked to help with the big fires, the ones that maybe start in a national park, or maybe they end up there, but we're rarely responding to incidents within the park specifically. If it wasn't for this encounter, I'd be saying never instead of rarely. I happen to be the closest person who could respond to a reported sighting of smoke in Cuyahoga. The Park Service was tied up in something already. I don't know what, and they needed someone to check the origin of the smoke site. More likely than not, I was looking for a group of campers who didn't know proper fire management. I would likely just tidy up their campsite, give them a lecture, and be on my way. It was easy enough. I was given the authority to evict the campers from the park if necessary, and they told me to put the coordinates of the smoke trail in my GPS. If it turned out to be more than a couple of campers with a large fire, I had a radio to get back in touch with the Park Service. Cuyahoga was beautiful that day. I remember wishing that I came out more often as I hiked my way toward the source of the smoke. The closer I got, the more I could smell it. Then I ran into them. The campers all but crashed into me, running away from their site. I thought the worst. The fire was out of control. But they were screaming out something else. There were 3 of them in the group. They were talking about a 4th member, somebody they'd met when they started their hike. It sounded like that 4th person was back toward the campsite. All I could understand was that the missing party had turned crazy. He had built a large fire and threatened to throw them into it. I was not trained how to handle situations like that. I called back to the Park Service and shared the story with them. They told me to move forward. What did that mean? I still have no idea. I just did what I was told. I still had to deal with fire, right? Even if there was some lunatic roaming the park. I have some basic self-defense training, and I was confident that I could defend myself if needed. Besides, the Park Service was strangely demanding. They didn't sound all too surprised about the report either. It felt like they wanted verification more than anything. If there was a 4th person out there, they wanted to know. I guessed it was because they couldn't afford to let an arsonist travel freely through the forest. I directed the campers back to the road and headed in the direction they came from. They weren't kidding about the fire. It looked like someone was planning to burn a witch at the stake. Luckily for me, it was already winding down. We could douse it easily, smother it if we had to. I reached for my radio but stopped when I heard someone walking around me. The 4th camper. He didn't say anything. He didn't himself. He was now just watching me from behind a tree. The Park Service knew the location of the fire. Based on my earlier contact, I was sure that the Rangers would be coming through shortly. They wouldn't know the whereabouts of this man though. I started to walk over to him, but he ran and I lost him fast. He had a head start and he seemed to know the area a lot better than me. Soon, I was tracking him through his footprints. I wasn't trained in that either, but the dirt was malleable and his feet made clear impressions. Bare feet. Believe it or not, what happened next is the reason this story has stuck with me. I followed those footprints until they disappeared, until they were replaced with a different kind of track. It was as if the man's feet changed. Suddenly, I was following something canine. I would learn later that they were coyote prints. At this point, I decided to return to the campsite to meet up with the Rangers. When I got back, they had extinguished the fire and dismantled the rest of the campsite. They were packing the campers' belongings into large vinyl bags. I told them about the 4th camper, and they laughed. It wasn't a genuine laugh either. It felt rehearsed, like they saw a big blinking sign above my head that gave them their cue. They told me I imagined it. They said the forest had a way of tricking the mind, especially if you were already looking for something specific. There were no signs of a 4th camper, they said. All of the belongings they had gathered were accounted for by the other 3. The fire, supposedly, had just gotten out of control and they wanted someone else to take the blame. I told myself that was a good enough reason. I told myself it made sense. However, I didn't really believe them. I had seen something different, so I came back the next day on my own. I wanted to see more of the Cuyahoga, remember? I made sure to hike past the campsite. Now it was taped off, government style, real official. Unlike anything I'd seen in the parks, outside of an active crime scene, I went to look for the tracks, and surprisingly they were still there, faint but visible. I wasn't imagining anything after all. I actually did chase something that went from the shape of a man into the shape of a dog. I saw something in the park that day that the service already knew about. I saw something that they want to keep secret. After getting my degree in environmental sciences in the early 2000s, I worked as a ranger for Montana State Parks for 3 years. During the third year, I used in park housing for the season. During that time, I started feeling really uncomfortable in the woods, which had never been my experience before. The area was a little isolated, but nothing I was unaccustomed to. I never had many strange encounters leading up to this one, but soon after moving in, I felt the woods around my cabin had an ominous feel to them. I started hearing strange noises pretty often. They would start off really slow and quiet, and it would be a faint noise in the background. Then all of a sudden it would turn manic and angry, then slowly go back down to quiet again. Other times it was a short, blood-curdling scream. I knew that a lot of animals can make some crazy sounds like raccoons or bobcats or foxes, so I convinced myself it was that. But still, it just never felt right. It's hard to explain, but I'd never felt like that before. And there's something about the woods around the place that made me feel like I was being watched. A few weeks after I moved in, there was a thunderstorm, and the thunder was loud enough to keep me awake. The lightning was crazy and was lighting up the whole surrounding area. I had been lying in bed and got up to get a glass of water at the sink. It was probably around 2 a.m. There was a window above the sink that gave a view of my yard leading up to the tree line. When the next flash of lightning hit, I saw it. It wasn't a long view, but it gave me enough time to see whatever this thing was. It was near the tree line, just a few steps into my yard. At first, I thought it was a bear, but wasn't. It was standing on 2 legs with its face pointed toward the house. Its legs were like a dog's, and I could clearly make out the hocks. It was hard to tell the color of the fur, but it was dark, and there was a huge mane around its neck. It had a huge chest with wide shoulders. The upper body was so much more massive than the lower body, and it had arms like a bodybuilder. I was so shocked. I just stood there and couldn't even move. I waited for the next lightning strike so I could get another glimpse. But when it came, the thing wasn't there. It happened so quickly and was gone so quickly. You can't imagine how shaken up I was. After that, I always kept my gun within arm's reach. I tried doing some research on animals in that area, but nothing matched that description. Some of my colleagues and I spent quite a bit of time searching the vicinity, but never found anything. Nothing else happened for several weeks. One night, I was watching a program and my satellite kept acting up. I didn't go outside much at night if I could help it, but this would be quick. I just had to move the antenna a bit. It sounds stupid now, but nothing had happened for a few weeks, so I decided to just go out and do it. I grabbed my gun and flashlight and went out. I made my way over to the satellite and began to adjust it. I noticed that the silence around me was a little unusual. Usually at that time of year in the summer, the woods were pretty active with all kinds of creatures, but the quietness that night was eerie. I heard a small snap of a stick and turned toward the sound and shined the light toward the direction of the noise. What I saw will horrify me for the rest of my life. I was immediately met with red eyes. The eyes were glowing and they looked demonic. The head of that thing looked like some horror show version of a hyena or something. It had a long snout and pointed ears. The fur was grayish brown and shaggy. Its upper body was way more massive than any human could be. When you put it all together, it looked like something out of a horror movie. It was at the edge of the woods just inside the trees. It was just kind of crouching there. Even while hunched over, it looked 6 feet tall. Fully standing, this thing would have been close to 8 feet in my estimation. I pulled out my pistol and weighed my options. I didn't know how confident I felt in getting off a lethal shot, but I was freaking glad I had it. I backed away slowly, without breaking eye contact with it. I wasn't far from my door at all, and my fight or flight reflexes kicked in and I ran. I still don't know if that was the best option, but you never know how you're going to react in that kind of situation until it happens to you. I ran the fastest I ever have in my life and didn't turn back once. I got in the cabin and locked the door and sat there cradling the gun for a long time until I could calm down. I called in to report it, and 2 rangers eventually arrived to give me support. But there wasn't much we could do in the dark. We didn't know what that thing was capable of. There was another search the next day, but we came up empty-handed. But that was the last night I spent in that cabin. I've never experienced such a thing as that again. I try not to dwell on it, but I still get nightmares. The image of that thing will never leave my memory. I'm an experienced park ranger. For over a decade, I've been one of many who have been entrusted with the guardianship of Alaska's Denali National Park, a vast, wild expanse of over 6 million acres. I've weathered the harshest winters, navigated through blizzards, and spent countless nights under the Alaskan skies. As a ranger, I am the park's eyes and ears. I ensure the natural balance remains undisturbed and visitors respect the rules of the wilderness. Most importantly, my role is to keep both the park's inhabitants and its human visitors safe. This role requires the utmost courage and resilience because more often than not, I find myself alone. Through the years, I've grown accustomed to this solitude, developed a sixth sense for danger, and learned the ways of the wild almost as well as the creatures that call it home. In all my years here, I've encountered almost every species native to this part of the world. Yet nothing could have prepared me for what I stumbled upon that fateful night last week. My assigned area is right out on the western edge of Denali. It's really remote out there, a place where you feel the real weight of the wilderness around you. My outpost is basically a small cabin, alone in a clearing surrounded by the forest. You step out of the door and you're faced with miles of woods in all directions. It's isolated, but it gives me a good view of the area. On a clear day, I can see right out to Denali. It's a great sight, watching the sunrise paint the peak in all kinds of colors. There are not many tourists in this part of the park. It's too far from the marked trails, so it's mostly just me and the wildlife out there. During the day, it's peaceful. But when night falls, it's a different story. Everything's shadowed and quiet, and you can get this feeling of being watched. It was during one of these quiet nights that I had an experience that still got me shaken. During one late-night patrol last week, I was given a job that was a bit out of the ordinary. A group of backpackers had reported some strange noises echoing through the night a few days prior. They described it as a series of clicks, like 2 stones being struck together but with an unnatural rhythm to it. It wasn't a sound any of them recognized from their time outdoors, and it had made them uncomfortable enough to pack up camp and move on. The backpackers couldn't pinpoint exactly where the noise came from, just that it seemed to be moving deeper into the forest. They marked their trail on a map before they left the ranger station, and my job was to follow it back and see if I could figure out what was making that noise. The night was a clear one. I set out on my ATV following the marked trail. The further I got into the woods, the quieter it seemed to become. I stopped a few times, turning off the engine and listening closely to the still night. The forest has a life of its own at night, a symphony of sounds that you get used to. But that night, it was different. The usual chorus of insects was absent. As I neared the spot where the backpackers said they heard a noise, I spotted something strange in the underbrush. Tracks. Unusual tracks. They were like human handprints and footprints, but larger, and with a distinct impression of claws. There were no bear or wolf prints to accompany them, just these strange unknown tracks leading off into the forest. I'm used to coming across evidence of the park's wildlife, but these were something different. And so I followed them. Eventually, it happened. I spotted the creature and everything seemed to fall quiet. The thing was pale like it hadn't seen sunlight in years, its skin practically glowing against the dark forest backdrop. It was gaunt, too. Looked humanoid, but off in a way I can't fully explain. Just didn't seem natural. Its eyes were the first thing I really noticed. Big, black, like staring into a couple of dark wells. There was no white to them, no irises, nothing. Just two black orbs in the place a human would have eyes. They sort of sucked in the moonlight, didn't reflect it like animal eyes usually do. Then there was the mouth, a dark gaping hole where you'd expect a nose and lips. Couldn't see any teeth, but I didn't need to. The sight of it was disturbing enough. The creature seemed to be almost sniffing the air, its strange mouth opening and closing slightly. But the real unsettling part was the noise it made. That same strange clicking the backpackers reported. It was rhythmic but unnatural, like someone rapping their knuckles against a table, but it echoed around the quiet forest in a way that made my hair stand on end. It was coming from the creature, seemingly from its open mouth. I've encountered all kinds of wildlife during my time in the park, but nothing like this. The sight, the sound, even the way the creature moved, it just wasn't right. The moment was tense. There I was, flashlight in hand, illuminating this eerie, alien-looking creature. It seemed to be studying me, its black eyes unreadable but intense. Now, standing there staring at this thing, I felt a type of fear I'd never experienced before. It was primal, like my instincts were screaming at me that this was wrong, dangerous. Yet, for all my fear, I couldn't move, the cold Alaskan air suddenly feeling even colder. We were locked in this strange standoff, just me and this creature, in the middle of a silent forest. Every muscle in my body was tensed, ready to react. I was hyper-aware of my surrounding and sound of my own breathing. Then, with a final echoing click, the creature broke our standoff. It moved with a startling speed, a blur of pale skin and limbs. Before I could even think to react or call it in, it had vanished into the underbrush. I was left standing there, the taste of adrenaline bitter in my mouth. I knew then that my night patrol had turned into something out of a nightmare. After the creature took off, it took me a moment to collect myself. My heart was still racing, thumping hard against my chest. I stood there for a few more seconds, straining my ears for any sign of that creature's return. I felt an odd mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the creature was gone. Dread at the thought of what I'd just witnessed. Slowly, my training kicked in. I grabbed my radio. My hands were shaking as I called it in. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, higher pitched and a bit shaky. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but words seemed inadequate to describe the creature. After the call, I stood there a while longer, still half expecting the creature to come bounding out of the forest again. But the only movement came from the gentle swaying of the tree branches in the breeze. Finally, I made my way back to my ATV. I couldn't shake off the feeling of those dark eyes watching me, and I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder, all the way back to the outpost. The ride back was a blur. My mind was stuck on replay, going over the encounter again and again. When I finally reached the safety of the outpost, I realized I was drenched in cold sweat, and my legs felt like jelly. For the rest of the night, I kept the lights on, the radio closed. The usual sounds of the night seemed sinister, and every shadow felt like it could hide that creature. I've faced many things in these woods, but nothing ever made me question my senses like this encounter did.